We're so happy to have you join us tonight. It is just an honor to have people from all over the world coming to hear Dr. Ross tonight. We're just thrilled to have her here with us. This is the fourth in our series of Women Erased. I think it's the fourth. As you know, in May, we started this series and we're looking at the way that women have been erased in so many ways, myriad ways in the church, in the lectionary, in the Bible, in our traditions, and in the way we tell our stories. And so tonight we have invited Dr. Susan Ross to talk with us about how women have been erased from the sacramental life. So before I do that, I just want to let you know that just a few rules in terms of how we're going to be together. This is being recorded, so if you do not want to show up on a recording for any reason, you know, you'd probably want to stop your video or not turn on your video and mute yourself, keep yourself muted. We do record them so that people who, for whatever reason, couldn't make it are able to view the video later. So we're just wanted to let you know about that. And later on, after Dr. Ross gives her presentation, we will have a Q&A. And I have a little system here where when your name comes up to the top, I ask you to ask your question. So then you'll unmute yourself, you'll ask your question, Dr. Ross will answer. And so try to stay on point if you can, and not so that we can get lots of questions in, because there will be lots of questions. I've heard Dr. Ross before. People have lots of questions. So let's try to share the floor when that happens. So to begin, I want to start with a little prayer. And tonight my prayer is coming from the Song of Our Hearts, Meditations of Our Souls. It's prayers for Black Catholics. And we know that this is an especially important time right now in the life of the church and in the life here in the US, especially where we're seeing many of our Black brothers and sisters murdered in the streets. And so as people of faith, we are very much about addressing racism within our society and in our church. And so I thought it was appropriate tonight that I would use a prayer from their prayer book. And it fits. The prayer is called Like a Motherless Child. And it's in the first person, but I'm going to use a more collective pronoun. Mother Church, we are here. Mother Church, we are ready. Mother Church, we are willing. Mother Church, we have been knocking for years. You have locked us out for years. We will not go away. We will not disappear. You have to open your doors. We will not stop knocking. Mother Church, we will knock until there is a hole in your door. We will come in through the hole. We will bring our open hearts and our open minds. We will bring our Mother, our God. Yes, Mother Church, we are here. We are knocking. We are willing. We are ready. We will no longer feel like a motherless child. Amen. So tonight I'd like to introduce our speaker. Dr. Susan Ross is a professor emerita. She retired last year after a long, illustrious career as professor of theology and faculty scholar at Loyola University, Chicago. She is the author of Anthropology, Seeking Light and Beauty, which was published in 2012. She's also the author of For the Beauty of the Earth, Women, Sacramentality and Justice, which was published in 2006. And my favorite, Extravagant Affections, a Feminist Sacramental Theology, which was published in 1998. She's also the author of over 75 journal articles and book chapters. She is the recipient of a Louisville Institute sabbatical grant, the Book of the Year Award from the College Theology Society in 1999, the Anne O'Hare Graff Award of the Women's Seminar of the Catholic Theological Society of America. She is the past president of the Catholic Theological Society of America and served as vice president and member of the editorial board of Concilium, International Theological Journal. From 2008 to 2016, she served as chair of the theology department at Loyola. She has taught many courses, including beauty and ethics, theological anthropology, conscience, and religion and gender. I want to welcome Dr. Ross here tonight and turn it over to her.
Thank you very much, Deb. And I have to just say a word. My voice is a little high and soft. I have a voice condition that gets treated periodically. And so for a while, I refer to this as my Minnie Mouse voice. So just as long as you can hear me, as I've always said to my students, that's the only thing that really counts. So what I'm going to say tonight is, of course, only a small fraction of what can possibly be said about this topic. And as I was trying to put things together, I just realized I only had a short amount of time. But it's such an interesting time to talk about women in the sacraments. I don't know about the rest of you present here, but I've not been to Mass since March. I haven't received communion in 6 months. I haven't sung in a church. I haven't exchanged the peace. I haven't been with my fellow parishioners. I've watched, I don't know what the right word is, 3 funeral masses for people that I worked closely with. I'm always very sad. None of them were COVID related, but I was grateful to feel a part of those ceremonies because they were streamed. I've actually attended one baptism, the child of a former student of mine, and we were all socially distanced and masked. So it's an interesting time to talk about the church as a sacramental church and about our own activity in that church. One of the things that's emerged from this time is the fact that women have borne the heaviest burdens when it comes to caring for the home and for children. And so I have to say, life hasn't changed radically for me or my husband. We're both retired baby boomers who I understand from various things I've read are some of the most fortunate people during the pandemic. But for many families, it's the women whose burden has dramatically increased with childcare, with schooling children at home, and in many cases working full-time on top of that. The New York Times had an article not too long ago that the headline read, "The virus has exposed gender fault lines in myriad ways." And that article begins with this very striking statement. Our formal economy is only possible because it's subsidized by women's unpaid work. And when I read that, I thought, I think we can say our sacramental life is only possible because it's subsidized by women's invisible work. Well, the virus has upended the economy, school, travel, everything. What it has done, I think, for the sacramental life of the church is reveal how our spiritual lives are really rooted in the home, in our bodies, and in our communities, rather than in bricks and mortar and in indelible marks reserved only to men. So what I want to talk about tonight, I'll do this in sort of 3 steps. First of all, I'll talk about sacraments and sacramentality and how defining sacraments has been part of both a historical and a theological process that's often sought to exclude women. The process is complicated and it's informed questions of power and legitimacy, especially in recent years. So as the understanding of gender has shifted in society, it has also changed in theology with serious implications for the sacraments. In the second step, I'll talk about how women's unacknowledged, invisible, and erased presence is so significant for sacramental life. What is it that women do and have been doing for centuries that makes the sacramental life of the church possible? And then third, I'll suggest how we can think and act sacramentally both now, without physical church going, and in our hoped for future, when we can re-envision our churches and parish communities as places where we live out our sacramental tradition. So first, a sacrament and sacramentality. So let me start with sacramentality, that broader kind of concept. As I think we all know, it's that recognition, and I'm quoting Mary Oliver here. For me, she says, the door to the woods is the door to the temple. And in the Catholic tradition, the world is first and foremost graced with the grandeur of God, as Gerard Manley Hopkins puts it. And while there's inevitably sin in the world, something our Protestant brothers and sisters can remind us, Catholics find God in the material, not only in the incarnation, but in saints, relics, statues, rosaries, processions, holy water, bread, oil, bodies, and sex. And God is found not only in beautiful things, but also where we least expect to find God, in the cross, in suffering, and in death. Now, the sacraments proper are where the church recognizes this in a formal way by designating certain rituals as central to the life of the church. And these are rituals that are rooted in the life of Jesus. Protestants recognize baptism in the Lord's Supper since they understand those to have been specifically mandated by Christ. Catholics, of course, recognize 5 more, but the number 7 it's not something that just kind of magically came down from heaven. Karl Rahner, the great Jesuit theologian, once said that the number of sacraments at 7 is really kind of arbitrary. And in fact, the 7 sacraments as we know them were officially designated as such only in the 16th century at the Council of Trent. It's kind of interesting to note that in the late Middle Ages, some people wanted religious vows to be a sacrament much more than marriage. So it's interesting that marriage became a sacrament and religious vows didn't. So it's important also then to note that sacraments have a history, and they didn't simply emerge straight from the mouth of Jesus in their present form. They've been influenced by culture, tradition, thought, and continue to be. The exclusion of women from ordination was, until not that long ago, until early in the 20th century, based on the subordinate nature of women. Thomas Aquinas taught this, and his reason was women couldn't be ordained because women lacked eminence of degree. It's kind of an interesting way to put it. But given movements of equality in the last 150 years, the argument has shifted. So it's no longer subordination, it's now this complementarity. So the official church teaching holds that women cannot image Christ at the altar because Christ was a man and only chose men to be among the 12. But even more so, maleness and femaleness have symbolic significance. And in many ways, this is due to the influence of Hans Urs von Balthasar, the Swiss theologian, who had such a strong influence on John Paul II. And to put it briefly, and I think probably everyone listening to this knows this already, in this whole schema, God as creator is essentially male because God is initiator and creation is essentially female. as an object of creation and as receptive to God. So think of how the laity in the church are often referred to as she. So this is based on, I think, a couple of things. First, a naive reading of Genesis, the Genesis story, as the male and the female, with the male coming first. And then also a very naive and incorrect understanding of biology, where the aggressive sperm swims to capture the passive ovum, which is in fact biologically very incorrect. So Christ, as God made flesh, is male. Women, of course, have their own essential dignity, which consists in being receptive, like Mary. So the dynamic is ultimately God is to creation, as Christ is to the church, as husband is to wife. And you can see that this also means that same-sex relationships are impossible because this, or at least they may be possible, but they're wrong, because this gender dynamic is not there. So this theological anthropology, that is, how we understand humanity from a theological perspective, has come to determine how sex and gender function in the sacraments. It also has pretty serious, and here I mean heretical, implications for how we understand God. My point is that this is a relatively recent theological development that is meant to allow the church to say, we don't think women are subordinate. We think women are equal to men, but women are different. Women have their own unique dignity. So then, to look at the sacraments themselves, it's interesting to note that in marriage, the partners are actually the sacramental ministers to each other. The priest or the deacon is the witness, and this is actually spelled out in canon law. And any baptized person we know can baptize in the case of an emergency. But for confirmation, reconciliation, anointing, Eucharist, it may seem that gender doesn't really make a difference in receiving it, except that women's role is always receptive. Women receive the sacraments but cannot be ministers of the sacraments, except in those two cases. So for 5 of the sacraments, women are dependent on ordained men. Now, some of you may remember Lavinia Burns' book, Woman at the Altar. This was published in 1993, just before the John Paul II statement, Ordinatio Sacerdotalis, was issued. And that statement underscored women's exclusion from ordination as official church teaching. And toward the end of her book, she makes this perceptive comment, which I, in a sense, borrowed above. She says, women can only ever be the passive recipients of sacramental grace, and never, with Christ, its initiators. So, this, in many ways, underscores the situation of women in the sacraments. So the implications of this, of course, are considerable. You've probably heard the story of when the priest comes to the CCD class and asks the children, now, how many sacraments are there? And a girl raises her hand and says, 7 for boys, 6 for girls. And that sense of exclusion from the sacraments is something many of us learned at a very young age. I wanted to become an altar girl, but in the 1950s, that was not an option. And the ironic thing is that while embodiment is how God becomes present to us in the person of Christ and in the very physical material sacraments, women's bodies are an obstacle to full sacramental participation. So back to history then. With Vatican II, with the decline in the number of clergy and religious, and with the increased numbers of lay people, especially women, in church life, the sacraments and ministry in general have become contested places, as the Vatican has tried to fence in as sharply as possible what is sacramental and what is not sacramental. Now, the concern is to make clear as possible, priests can do this, laity cannot. So I'm just going to give you a really short quote from the 1997 document on the collaboration of the non-ordained faithful with the clergy. And this is in a little section that has to do with liturgical vestments. And I'll just read the very short quote here. Every effort must be made to avoid even the appearance of confusion, which can spring from anomalous liturgical practices. As the sacred ministers are obliged to wear all the prescribed liturgical vestments, so too the non-ordained faithful may not assume that which is not proper to them. That's 23 years ago. In that same statement, we find it very clearly written that the priest is the sole dispenser of the sacraments. I'm quoting from that document. Just this past July, just a couple of months ago, the Vatican issued another statement policing the titles that lay people can have, as they did in 1997. That just makes it very clear some titles we simply cannot give to the laity, that they use all the time anyway. And I think in some ways the worst of this kind of thinking and policing was in the example of the supposedly invalid baptism of the Detroit priest that I think a lot of people have probably been familiar with. So I guess on a technical level, it's possible to understand the issue. I've seen both Bruce Morrill and Susan Wood, who are very wonderful, respectable sacramental theologians, explain the whole process. But on a pastoral level, it seemed to me at least, it showed how far legalism has come. And one commentator, I think it was Tom Rees, said that the sacraments shouldn't be like a computer. You know, if you're trying to program a computer, if you get one character wrong, the whole thing has to be redone. So are we trying to think of the sacraments like a computer program where you have to be exact? So all of this says, I think it's a fear of blurring boundaries. Sacraments have unfortunately become places of power that need to be exclusively, we see, in the hands of men. But the thing is, sacraments are meant to be boundary breaking. Sacraments are where God, the infinite, comes and is present to us in the finite. God is found in the sexual joy between two people in a marriage. God is found in bread and wine. God is found in oil. God is found in all of these things. And all of those things break boundaries. So this ambiguity, this boundary breaking is, in the eyes of the officials at the Vatican, confusion. And I take issue with that. Now I want to go to my second point, which is about women's erased and invisible presence. When I was writing my book, Extravagant Affections, almost 25 years ago, one friend of mine asked me, what could the book possibly be about? What is there to say? And it was really interesting to try and answer his question. Susan White, who's done a wonderful book called A History of Women in Christian Worship, says in the introduction to her book, one of her friends told her that that book was going to be one of the great short books of all time. Teresa Berger has written a wonderful book called Women's Ways of Worship, and all of these books have been able to show how there is so much in the tradition that simply has not been made more available to people. So both Berger and White note how little attention has been given to women's contributions in the standard works of liturgical and sacramental history. Women have always been active in the church and have served many sacramental functions over the years. And Phyllis Sagano has dedicated her life's work to showing how the diaconal work of women is in fact sacramental. And she also points out how the devastating implications of women's inability to represent Christ, to represent the divine to all of us, has terrible and disastrous implications for their lives. Now, when I was writing that book, as I said, 25 years ago, I asked my graduate student at the time to research everything that had been written about gender in the sacraments after Vatican II. So after a few weeks, she came back to me and she said she couldn't find anything. And I said, thank you. That's what I was hoping to find out. But I wanted to prove it, and I wanted her to see what she could find, and she didn't. So it doesn't mean that women were not part of the story. It simply shows that mainstream scholarship doesn't pay attention to what women have been doing. And unfortunately, this is still true across the board. After teaching for almost 40 years at Loyola, I would still have students just a couple of years ago come into classes, especially the graduate students, who had no knowledge of feminist work in general, and certainly not in the sacraments. Now, some years ago, Christine Gudorf, the theologian, wrote a wonderful article called Sacraments and Men's Need to Birth. She pointed out that sacramental rituals take what is ordinarily done by women, when you think about it, giving birth, feeding, welcoming, reconciling, and the sacraments elevate these to a higher, holier status. Think of how baptism is sometimes regarded as real birth, and the Eucharist is real food, as if the very physical birthing and feeding were really not all that significant. So the sacraments become separated from the ordinary activities on which they're based. And what this does is make the religious and sacramental activity disconnected from everyday life and immune from the basic ethical demands of that everyday life. So there's what the feminist ethicist Joan Tronto refers to as a moral boundary between the religious and the secular, or the sacramental and the everyday. The religious dimension operates on this higher level and does not have to observe the rules of everyday life. And so this not only denigrates what women do and have done, but it also removes the sacramental and ritual actions to a sphere that can't be questioned because it's in the holy. So think of how the issue of ordination and of same-sex marriage now can't even be discussed or questioned. Think of what Tony Flannery, the Irish priest, who was asked to sign a statement saying he agreed with church teaching on this, he refused to do it. And it basically says we can't argue about fairness with these issues since the religious sphere, it doesn't operate there. The sacramental sphere doesn't operate by those rules. So now after Vatican II, with women taking on more and more responsibilities and demanding justice, the Vatican wants to make sure that that keep out sign is highly visible and enforced, and that this is not a question of justice. I mean, we're told that over and over. And it seems to me that the more women are involved in the ritual life of the church, the more the institutional church wants to strongly separate what is sacramental and what is not. So it makes me think of the early church epistles where women are told to be silent in the churches, women are told to ask their husbands things at home. And you think, what was really happening there? Women were obviously not being silent in the churches. But I ask whether such hard and fast lines have to be drawn and whether thinking of the sacred and the everyday is more closely joined might help us become a more just sacramental church. So I would just note here that there's wonderful work being done that I can't possibly summarize all of it in terms of what has been the practice of women in religious traditions and in their sacramental communities over the ages. Women heard confessions, women anointed people, but those things are hidden from us now because those stories weren't told. So with COVID, the situation we're in now, the rituals we do at home, if we do them, I think they're coming to take on renewed significance. And it brings me back in some ways to those pre-Vatican II days when there were so many things that lay people did. When you think about it, there were rosaries, sacramental preparation processions, pilgrimages, novenas, retreats, many of these lay-led. And a lot of this, I think, was lost after Vatican II because the Constitution on the Sacred Liturgy, of course, says that the Eucharist is the fount and summit of the Church's liturgical life. And I'm not disagreeing with that. I think it makes a lot of sense. And those of us online here who remember the pre-Vatican II Church, I remember watching people around me saying their rosaries while the Mass was going on way, way up there in the distance. So this refocusing makes a lot of sense. But what's happened is that there's a disempowering of lay devotions. And so to me, it's not a surprise at all that they're having a comeback. The young people nowadays are wanting to bring back Eucharistic devotions and the 40 hours, and things like that, because there are ways in which the lay spirituality can have a sacramental expression in the church. So my last point here, how can we move forward? One thing that I've heard multiple times in recent months is that so many people have found themselves spending more time in scriptural reflection on their own, of meeting with other lay people on Zoom, of having Zoom-led worship services. And some people have actually kind of made it kind of clear that they don't have to tolerate these terrible homilies and sometimes embarrassingly bad homilies at Masses. So I think it's empowering to women and to the laity, and remember, the laity are the women of the church, that there are ways that we can break open the scriptures for ourselves and for our families, to share these in ways that we may not have done before. And so while preaching is technically not a sacrament, it is, according to the Vatican, reserved to ordained men. So that lay people or women we can offer reflections at the end of Mass, but this is often an exception or a last resort, as of course are women readers and Eucharistic ministers who cannot be formally installed in those offices unless they're men. But now, women and men are breaking open the scriptures at home, finding resources online on their own, and they're not dependent on clergy to hear and break open the Word of God. And I think the pandemic has also made much clearer the social and economic inequities that are unfortunately so much a part of our world, especially hunger. Perhaps you, like me, have been baking bread. I started baking bread this spring, and I managed to kill off 2 sourdough starters, back to yeast. But the Eucharist is where we encounter Christ in our daily bread. But it seems to me that rather than focusing on the consecrated wafer we receive at Mass, why not focus on all of those who are hungry for food? Why not use some of our energy to make sure that no one goes hungry? We are in a kind of sense of Eucharistic fast. And I would say we're not so much in a Eucharistic famine, but it's a Eucharistic fast. And like any fast, what it does is bring our attention even more closely focused on what it is that we're missing. And so I think we have the opportunity to consider how it is that a Eucharistic fast can be a time for us really to be the food, to help provide the food that is so needed all over the world. And a third point, I think reconciliation is a real challenge today with this incredibly divisive political and ecclesiastical issues driving so much of our discussion. So we have bishops who are saying that a vote for a Democrat is a ticket to hell, that we should be enthusiastic about exacting retribution through the revival of state executions. And by the way, I was happy to finally see the U.S. Catholic bishops speak out against this. So, and I just read this morning that the Vatican statement about the denial of the sacraments to politicians who approve of euthanasia laws, it was very interesting because here again, it's a kind of use of the sacraments as a kind of a weapon. So in this sense, I think what we need to consider is how we can make our sacramental life more pervasive in our everyday lives. When I was in the Catholic Theological Society of America's presidential line, we used to have dinners with the Bishops' Committee on Doctrine before they had their annual meeting. And one time I asked them whether they had considered taking time to listen to women as to why women would seek to have abortions and how they could work to make conditions for women and families better so that abortions wouldn't be something that people felt that they had to choose. So reconciliation can be a painful struggle for people who have experienced abuse at the hands of clergy. The point here is that these divisions can't just be voted or legislated away. They need to be part of deeper discussions with willingness on all sides to listen to others' pain, involving real efforts at reconciliation. So I think my time is about up. But what I want to conclude by saying here is the sacraments have never been, nor should they be, the property of the clergy. When I hear about Archbishop Cordileone of San Francisco say, "Free the Mass," I want to say, who put it into prison? So yes, we all miss the community, the singing, the Eucharist, but I think this is a chance to reflect on how our entire lives can be more sacramental in the sense that women have always known. How we can see the everyday ways that we bring Christ into the world, in how we help to welcome, feed the world, reconcile, educate, comfort. In other words, how we can do what women have always done by making holy not just the Sabbath, but every day. So thank you very much. That's my thoughts for tonight, and I really am eager to hear your questions.
Thank you, Susan. Oh my gosh. Yeah. What wisdom. This touches my heart. So many of the things that you have said tonight. So we're going to open up the lines for your questions. The one thing that I, just to say off the top of my head, having just heard the women in the Amazon talk about what they were doing, I was thinking about, you're talking about women of old, Susan, women in our history who have, anointed and heard confessions and blessed, and those were exactly the things that we were hearing about the women in the Amazon. And it just breaks my heart and really causes a lot of anger for me as well, that the men who have the authority to do so can't, offer a sort of sacramental ordination for the women who are already doing that work. So
Right. Yeah.
So let's start with, let's see here. I'm not who has a question for Susan tonight. And, I forgot to tell you, if you have a question, go ahead and unmute yourself, and that brings you to the top of the list. And that way I know that you have a question, and then I will call on you. So, Rita, Houlihan, will you go ahead?
Oh, okay. Thank you so much. Susan, thank you. It was great to hear you and your thoughts. I really didn't know what to expect tonight. So one of my main questions is, first, could you give Russ and Deb the names of those books?
I have a PowerPoint slide that I will attach to this, and so that I have actually pictures of the covers of the books on all of those. So I can actually share that a little later.
Oh, lovely. Lovely. Thank you. So I was intrigued by this concept that the sacraments should never be and have never been the property of the clergy. And I was wondering if you could give us some guidance as to where, maybe a simple book or article that could give us a little bit of a chronological history of sacraments and how they emerged from, community rituals and like what role the Order of Widows played, for example, in reconciliation when somebody was welcomed back in to a community, an early church community.
Yeah, well, there are so many resources there. So Phyllis Agano's work is very helpful in talking about how women's work of basically their diaconal work, their work as deacons. And, her main argument is that this is a revival of a ministry that women performed and in fact today do perform within the Orthodox churches, some of the Orthodox churches. So her work is very helpful. I think any of the work of David Power, the late wonderful sacramental theologian from Catholic University, Bernard Cook's work is also, he gives a wonderful history of the sacraments in a number of his different books. So I'm just, I feel like I need to turn around and go to my bookshelf and read off the list of things. But those are just a couple of names to start out with, in addition to the books that I've mentioned. Teresa Berger, especially, her book called, I have to look at the title here. It's called Women's Ways of Worship, Gender Analysis and Liturgical History. And then Susan White's book, A History of Women in Christian Worship. Both of those. Susan White's book is pretty ecumenical, but both of those books do a wonderful job of detailing how women's participation in sacramental traditions has been a long part of the Church's tradition.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Rita. Julie, Oreo Goats.
Thank you. Every time I hear Pope Francis say that we need a theology of women, my response is, I think we need to develop a theology of the feminine side of God. And as I heard your kind of introduction and overview of theology of the body, I think you kind of basically said that, is that there was this limitation of God to the masculine God, the creative, the active. Is that a correct take?
Yes, I think so. So, two things. So, with Pope Francis, I used to think that he was teachable when it came to gender. And I would say two things about Pope Francis is that, first of all, he's an 80-something Argentinian cleric who is very much a person of his own culture. And then secondly, women's issues have never been at the top of his agenda. He's concerned about refugees, he's concerned about poverty, he's concerned about climate change, issues that we should all be concerned about. And this, I think he tends to see gender issues as a kind of North American gender ideology idea that seeks to do away with any kind of quote-unquote natural distinction between the sexes. So I think there's a real profound misunderstanding of the role of gender and sexuality. And then when it comes to the way in which our theology has understood gender, it's just kind of striking to me, and I haven't done all the history on this. There's scholars I could recommend for this, but that the way that this kind of shifted into this theology of complementarity, which has really been picked up not only by the Catholic tradition, but by the Protestant, the kind of complementarian tradition. And it's a way of doing, quote, equality it's a way of doing equality while being able to say separate but equal. And we know it's separate but equal. We know the history of that. And so I think there is a real fear of women on the part of the clergy. I think that there is a concern, perhaps on the Pope's part, that this would be incredibly divisive. And so he's staying away from it. And it's doing an injustice. And the recent kind of hubbub about the title of the new encyclical, Fratelli Tutti, people will say, well, in Italian, that doesn't matter. Well, the church is not all Italian. There's a whole world out there. And I think the idea that that we mainly think of men when we get this kind of language, it does to the imagination. It just means that women are an afterthought, or if not an afterthought, even worse, that women don't matter as much as men do.
Thank you. We have Ron and Bonnie Strand has a question. I don't know.
Yes.
If it's Ron, somebody there.
Bonnie is here.
Okay, Bonnie. Okay, good. All right.
I wanted to thank you so much for speaking about, Susan, about the bread and the reconciliation and the provider, that we are able to do what we are just made to do anyway. And it gives me hope. Thank you very much.
Great, thank you. Thank you. I'm not trying to say also that there shouldn't be sacraments, that, breakfast, lunch, and dinner are just, but that there's a kind of, and I talk about this in my book, there's a kind of ambiguity, there's a tension there that needs to be kept alive, that is not, it's not an abyss between the sacramental and the supposedly non-sacramental.
Thank you.
Sadika, you have a question?
Yes, I do. Thank you. I really enjoyed your presentation. Do you think it's
Thank
time
you.
we have theology of men?
Could you just say that again?
Do you think it's time we had a theology of men?
Well, we do. That's what pretty much is called theology. Feminist theology, in a sense, is what my former colleague Jamie Phelps used to call adjectival theology. So the fallback, the default, is always the male. And so if you Black theology, feminist theology, liberation theology, Eucharistic theology, those are all qualifications. But I do take your point seriously, and I think what you're really asking is, do we want to spend some time, do we want to investigate more what it means to be man in this tradition, and how that's understood from a critical gender perspective? In other academic fields, there are masculinity studies that have really kind of taken this issue up, and there are a number of scholars who are dealing with masculinity studies. And actually, one of my former students, a wonderful scholar named Hoon Choi, who's at Bellarmine University, he's done a lot of work actually on the kind of theology of masculinity that has been very harmful, not only for the church and for women, but for men as well. So I think we're seeing some of this work being done, but obviously more of it needs to take place.
Thanks. So George Morrison, you have a question.
Yeah, I'll put it as a statement and see if you can take it that way. The woman's problem is rooted in the fact that Constantine made the church made it a department of the empire, and he ruled through the bishop. Qualified as you wish.
So I'm not sure I got the whole question there. There was a little kind of pause.
Yep. How much of our problems with the way with women are treated goes back to the fact that Constantine made the Catholic Church a unit of a department of his empire, and ruled the church through the bishop.
Okay, yeah. Well, I think it actually goes back even before Constantine. So that's 325, and you're right that what that does is institutionalize the hierarchy in a way that it hadn't been institutionalized before. But you still have the Desert Fathers avoiding women at all possible costs. You still have people like Tertullian saying women are the gateway to the devil. So I think that there's this thread of misogyny that runs through the scriptures. It runs through some of the Pauline literature. Whether Paul wrote it or not, we don't know. And I think when the church gets this kind of power, which tends to be male military power, that tends to kind of get that power more institutionalized. And so I think what Constantine probably did was to take these tendencies and solidify them and institutionalize them. But I don't think it only goes back to Constantine. I think, and you can't say that only Christianity is not the only religious tradition that has problems with women, you know. And it's not because if Christianity has problems with women, it's not that it's terrible. There are problems, but I mean, it's true of Judaism, it's true of Islam, it's true of Hinduism and Buddhism. All religious traditions share this reluctance to see women in the place of the sacred.
Thank you. Okay, for Lonnie, you have a question?
Yeah, well, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Well, I was thinking when you started your presentation, Susan, that about missing the Eucharist and not going to Mass, as I think all of us have. But I was thinking of my own experience in that time. From the time of Easter Sunday, I have gathered with friends on Zoom, and we have celebrated liturgy.
Yeah.
Not only sharing on the word, but with bread and wine at our place.
Yes.
And remember what Jesus did.
Yeah.
To me, that is Eucharist. And from the feedback from the people who have participated in it, that is Eucharist to them. And so what it has brought me to is that, that we need to reclaim our access to that, and so it kind of made me raise a question, what is it that makes us willing to be deprived of what is so important to us?
Yes.
Yeah. That's a really good point. And, you're one of a number of people who've made that point to me. What I would just say, though, is that in those various ways in which groups can celebrate together, what that doesn't include, though, and what I always like about church, even though it can drive me crazy sometimes, is the fact, and it's the old James Joyce quotation, here comes everybody. And so what church offers is to go in there and everybody's welcome. I may usually sit next to the same people at church, but somebody might be in my pew, one day. And so I think that the kind of community of diversity and inclusion, which many of our churches don't do a very good job with, because too many of our churches are segregated economically, racially, ethnically, all of that. But I think that those smaller, I've been part of a Zoom kind of tradition with my family for the last 6 months of sharing the scriptures. We don't do the breaking of bread, but what it does is it's empowered, I think, many of us to feel much more connected with the elements of the sacraments. And so I'm saying, I'm not saying that's not really Eucharist. I agree with you. That's Eucharist. But it's a different Eucharist than being in the kind of open context of a diverse and inclusive church, which welcomes whoever walks in off the street. So that's the part that I miss, which is being confronted with not just my good friends, but being confronted with sometimes a homily that will really strike me. It does happen. And so that broader sense of church is the part that I hope that we can bring this closer sense of the importance of how we live sacramentally back to our churches, which I think tend to be places where the sacraments are kind of located there, and then you go back home.
Thank you, Dr. Ross.
One more question. We're already a little past, and I know we're straining your voice. I feel bad about that.
No, I'm fine. I'm fine. I sound more straight than I am.
See, here they all come. Here we all come. Here comes everybody as we want to ask you questions. So let's ask. So there's somebody, B. Basmelko. I'm not sure that's the name that's showing up. Has a question.
My question is, it's more of a follow-up on the idea that the recent encyclical was addressed to my brothers.
Right.
And, what I'm thinking is, Black Lives Matter, women in the church matter, women matter in the church or not. Is there a way in which women then can address the Vatican? What is the possible letter writing? Like, this is kind of like bringing all of us together and saying, if all of us wrote a letter to the Vatican and said, can you change that vocabulary? We could do that. So it's just kind of like a thinking out loud.
Right.
Somehow, all the women who are saying this, everybody on this video here, needs to do something verbally, like Black Lives Matter. And until we do that, and in the courtyards outside of the Vatican and around the world, it's going to go on forever. So this is wonderful to hear the theology, but changing anything except ourselves, which is important.
Yeah.
Because at least I'm not going to, jump off the nearest bridge and say heaven is much better than this.
Well, yeah, thanks. So just a couple of little thoughts. So there's a group of women who have been going to Rome every time there's a meeting and basically demanding to be heard. And the group Catholic Women Speak, which probably many of you are on that Facebook page or email list. That's one of the places, and they have delivered these messages to the Vatican and to bishops. One of my senses here is that we have to vote with our pocketbooks, because I think that's where it really hurts. I remember that not quite 20 years ago, when the sex abuse cases first began hitting the newspapers, my friend and colleague Lisa Cahill from Boston College wrote an op-ed piece for the New York Times, and she said, if you want to get across to the bishops, stop contributing. Now, of course, that means that parishes do all kinds of good things, and you don't necessarily want to just say, I don't want to give you any money. But I mean, I have done this too. I've withheld my money because I've been so angry. I was angry after the Synod on the Amazon. I was angry at the U.S. Catholic bishops, etc. But I think simply, well, I won't say simply. I think writing letters and all of that is important, but I think we just can't shut up. So I think we have to keep speaking, and we have to keep pressuring parishes, dioceses, U.S. Bishops' Conference. They're pretty deaf in many ways. Not all of them, but not many parishes. But I mean, in some ways, the larger organizations aren't really taking all of this in. But the thing is, I think a lot of us, we're just not going away.
Thank you very, very much. Just to say very quickly, I'm going to turn this over to Ross, but very quickly, there is also a huge international women's movement called the Catholic Women's Council, who are planning, and Future Church is a part of this, and lots of reform organizations in the United States. In terms of one of these, the dream you're talking about, let's all get together and use our voice. Well, because of COVID, it's been delayed until March of 2021. But there is this huge stirring. And if you've heard of Maria 2.0 in Germany, I mean, we're going to see a lot of changes. I think maybe not US led, but we can certainly all come together around this energy that is building where women are standing up and saying, we're not doing this anymore. And you talk about in Germany where women do everything. And they just said for a week last year, they just went on strike. Nobody came.
Yeah.
And so as we build our own strength, we need a number of strategies: education, speaking up, writing, and we need some direct action. And this is part of a direct action, nonviolent direct action. We really do need to step it up in the same way that Black Lives Matter have and so forth. In the church, we need to find those levers and to say, because we're ready. I think we're ready. I mean, anything that comes out, an encyclical that comes out and only says brothers, I mean, what, it's like, what world are they living in? We're just so far away from that anymore. And in a church where we're still hearing, in some cases on the Feast of the Holy Family, wives be subordinate to your husbands. It's optional, but there are plenty of priests still reading it. I mean, that is hard on the ears of people in healthy marriages. But think about how much domestic violence is propped up around those kinds of things. We need women everywhere in this church, and that's what we're building. And Future Church does a lot of work around that, just so you know. Russ, I'll turn it over to you so I can get off my pulpit here.
Thanks, Deb, and thanks again, Susan, for your wonderful presentation. Just a couple of announcements before we end with our closing prayer. So the next in this series is #nuns2, the media's role in obscuring the abuse of women by priests. And that is going to be on October 8th at 8 p.m., October 8th at 8 p.m. It'll be a very, I think, intriguing conversation about the role that the downplaying of the abuse of women by priests played in fostering a narrative that the abuse crisis was somehow an issue with gay priests, et cetera. It served their purposes. So that's going to be presented by Professor Tara Tuttle, and I think you'll really enjoy it. So please join us for that. That's October 8th at 8 p.m. Also, I wanted to let you all know that our fall event tickets are up and available online. And I'm going to go ahead and drop the link there for you in the chat box. But it's futurechurch.org/2020. Try to make it pretty easy for you. So it's futurechurch.org/2020. And there you can find more information about our fall event, which is going to happen across 2 nights. The first night is Thursday, October 22nd, and the second night is Tuesday, October 27th. Excuse me. On the first night, we welcome Dr. Cecilia Gonzalez Andreu, who is a brilliant theologian out at Loyola Marymount, who is going to be offering a keynote presentation, Public, Prophetic, and Provocative, a new way of being church. She's essentially going to make sense, try to make sense of 2020 for us, some good sense of 2020. And if anyone can do it, I know she can. She's brilliant. Also that night, we'll be joined by Doris Wagner Reisinger, who is going to accept our Christine Schenck Award for young Catholic leaders. She was abused by an official, a priest and an official at the CDF. And her speaking out at one of the Catholic Women Voices of Faith events in Rome actually led to that official's resignation. And then on Tuesday, October 22nd, 7th, we welcome Dr. Brian Massingale, who is one of the preeminent voices on racism, not only in society, but also in the church. And he's going to accept our Louis Trivison Award for his leadership in that area. And he's also going to give us a presentation. We normally don't ask our our Truson Award winners to give us a full-length presentation, but he's going to be giving us a full-length presentation to make that night worth it. We wanted to spread things across 2 nights just to make sure that everyone was comfortable. We know that Zoom is not always the easiest thing to sit in front of for a few hours, so we've split it into 2 parts and hope you can join both. If you can't join both, please join one or the other. Again, that's futurechurch.org/2020. We'd love to have you. And let us pray. We give you thanks, O God, that in every age you raise up holy, wise, courageous, and persistent women who lead us closer always to you and to one another through their faithful witness, leadership, and ministry. We pray that their presence in our scripture and history, in our communities and in our celebrations, in our very lives, increase our desire for the wholeness you planned. May their witness embolden our work for justice and equality. May their faithfulness inspire us as we seek to respond faithfully to you. And may they encircle us as a great cloud of witnesses tonight and always, strengthening us with their prayers as we work to recover and reclaim for ourselves, for our church, and for our world. We make this prayer in Jesus' name. Amen.
Amen. Russ, I have just 2 short slides. Can I just pull them up so they'll be part of the...
Oh, sure. Let me make sure you have the ability to do that.
I think I do.
Oh, yes, because you're a co-host, so you should be able to share.
There we go. So the Teresa Berger's book, and then Susan White's book, and then my own book from 20-some years ago, Lavinia Burns' book, and Phyllis Sagano's book.
Beautiful. Thank you very much. So, again, thank you for, I just being in your presence is just such an honor and a joy.
Oh, thank you. It's good to be with you too.
You bring such, just a deep wisdom along with your the academic rigor that you bring to everything. And so we're so glad that you're here. And as we close out, Russ, we will do as we always do and have our beautiful, chaotic goodbyes so that people can say goodbye to one another and as we sign off, because it has been just such a joy to share this evening with you all. And I hope that you will join us again next month. We promise this series will continue and we'll bring these wonderful, wonderful scholars to you to talk about how women have been erased.